you back in the winter.
Yeah,
Once things get, I guess when people get active again. I guess it's the last of August, and it's so hard
absolutely.
to get any attention. But you look beautiful and lovely
Oh,
as
thank you.
always.
Oh,
I love
spectacular.
love the look. And
It's
of course,
hot in my on my third floor. That's mostly it's like, what can I wear that looks professional and I'm not gonna die in?
but we are thrilled to have you. We have shared your bio all over our private network Facebook page, and so we with what, instead of me just rambling on, you've gotten to know Asha. Asha was also the former president of Mississauga, and Tanya was the former president of Barrie. So you've got like a mix of women here, and all of those that are going to tune in, and you are going to want to see Laura 100 times back, because she's got some incredible information and extended background in history, and educational background on this topic and similar topics, including diversity. So with no further ado, we are just going to give over the floor to Laura. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me today. I am so privileged. And when Lisa reached out and asked, I was really honored and excited, because this is something I'm very passionate about. People always like, oh, you speak so passionately. And I'm like, that's my calm public presentation. You don't hear me at home. But I think it's so important. And I am newer to real estate. I come to real estate from academia. I hold my PhD, as Lisa was mentioning. My PhD is in religious diversity in North America from the University of Waterloo. And I look at the ways that women in particular, but gender narratives, shape how women in public spaces are seen as a threat or not, and particularly around debates around veiling, or what is too much skin to show, what is not enough skin to show, all these things. But these are all things that point to how we treat women in public spaces. Like everything, it's like, okay, we're talking about this issue, but really we're talking about all of this: race, gender, age, classism, like it all intersects. So when I entered real estate, I knew that I wanted to bring that work and background into the industry. And I was thinking more in terms of with clients and serving the communities, which is still a big part of what I do. But immediately, like just right away with courses, I couldn't get over how, I don't want to use the word outdated, but I'm going to use the word outdated. Gender narratives are still in the industry. And it was a little bit of a bucket of cold water for me. I mean, we don't have gender equity anywhere. I was gonna say anywhere in Canada, but anywhere. It doesn't really exist. But some of the language that was still used, some of the things that I was hearing in professional settings as jokes or just as givens really shocked me a little bit. And I could see right away that, okay, so there is something here to, what I have found talking to some incredible badass women like yourselves. I am so just thrilled to talk to women who are powerhouses like yourselves, is that many women share the experiences, but not everyone can put it in words to articulate, well, why is this happening? Or what's kind of going on? Is it about me? Is it about this brokerage? Is it about this? And it's like, well, no, it's real estate is part of society. It's not really about real estate per se. It's about the society we live in, and then how that shapes the language we use, how women are treated, how female agents, female brokers, female presidents are treated differently than their male counterparts. And I mean, I just want to say from the start that it's a given that when I talk about women, I'm using it inclusively of people who identify as women. And that's a whole other further conversation to be had around queer identifying trans and women within the real estate community, and how do trans agents get treated, or brokers or presidents? Do we have any trans presidents? Like there's a whole other conversation to be had. We can only cover so much today. So I'm just making that note that it's inclusive language, but we're going to start with sort of more basics around what's going on and why. And I really welcome everybody's experiences and shared thoughts and questions. My plan is I'm going to talk with you for about 30-ish minutes, and then we're going to open up and have conversation, questions, your own stories, because I am positive you have them, especially once we start going. So, oh, I just changed my screen. There we go. Without further ado, I'm going to share some slides with you here. It's going to, sorry, just give me one moment. I didn't mean to close that window. Here we go. Why didn't allow me to do that? Let's try this. Okay, so are you seeing a presentation? Okay, that's good. Okay, you can see that okay?
I guess we're angling the younger demographic, because I think that the four of us here are trying to stay away from the whole sex sells subject.
Well, you'll see where I'm going, because of course I'm actually using it as a pun, because it's about why male agents have a financial advantage in the field, and the studies out of the States that have shown that. And so it's a play on words, because academics like catchy words to make our research sound less dull. So anyway, so I wanted to start by sharing with you, when my daughter was in grade 5, her school was putting on a production of The Lion King, and my daughter's quite gifted in the performing arts, and she had her eye set on being Simba. And when she and her classmates were talking about who they wanted to be, and she said she wanted to be Simba, her classmate said, well, you can't be Simba, you're not a boy. And without missing a beat, she said, I'm not a lion either. I was very proud. I'm like, I'm done here, you could. But I thought that exchange really points to our gender lines in society. I was telling that story to a friend of mine who's a gender scholar, and she said, you know, God forbid that we push gender lines. It's fine to pretend you're a lion, but to want to hold the boy part in the play is pushing it a little too far. So why is that? And what is it that makes that such a given that you don't even have to ask a question? Well, it starts with just sort of a basic 101 on what is gender. And I always tell my students, the simple explanation that gender scholars will tell you is that sex is what you're born with. Gender is the role that society asks you to play. And so they're not the same thing. They tend to get conflated as the same thing, but they're not. You can identify biologically as female, but fill more of a, quote, masculine role in society, or vice versa. When a woman fills a masculine role, then she will be challenged, but she is elevating her station. When a biological male fills a traditionally feminine role in society, he is devaluing his status, which is why he'll be mocked for it, and why a man in a dress is a punchline, but a woman in a power suit is aspirational, because we devalue that which has been marked as feminine. So let's just talk about some of the realities of society we live in, because I know that I don't have to convince anyone on this call that this is, guess what? We don't have gender equity yet. But I am sure you've heard the same things I do every day, which is women have more rights than men do. Women have scholarships that men don't have access to, that we don't, you know, we're good now in Canada. Sure, in, quote, other places it's a problem, but not here. Well, these are statistics that are studied, and I have the sources for anyone who would like them. But we know that women, on average, spend twice as many hours doing unpaid labor as their male counterparts, both in the home and in the workplace. The getting the coffee for the board meetings, the taking notes, the things that, the extras, the tidying up after a meeting. Women still make 81 cents for every male dollar, and then that continues to decrease when you bring in other intersections such as race. So Black women make 61 cents to the white male dollar, Latina women make 53 cents to the white male dollar, and Indigenous women make 58 cents to the white male dollar. 2019, 85 women were promoted to managerial roles in the corporate world for every 100 men. And of course, the COVID seashells by the seashore. She-cession has been catastrophic to women in the workforce. It will take decades to regain the ground that we've lost in the last year and a half. And it's across sectors and industries, but we're seeing it in law, we're seeing it among the professorate, we're seeing it among servers and the service industry. And so the reason I point these numbers out to people often is they say, well, it's not a problem. Or you'll hear, well, women just make different choices than men do. And you have to start asking yourself, well, if 85 women are promoted to a corporate managerial role, we're not even talking about C-suite, those numbers are catastrophic, but just a managerial role, is it that 100 men are better than their female counterparts? Is it that's consistently that men perform better, that men are better at these roles? Or are there other things going on that are streamlining men's chances and putting barriers and restrictions for women? And so this is, I have to say, you can use this, one of my favorite things to point out when I'm arguing with my male trolls online or just in a crowd discussion, because if they say, well, this, that, or the other, then you just ask straight out, do you think that men are worth making twice as much as an Indigenous woman? Do you think that men on average provide twice as much value as an Indigenous woman? And very few men are willing to say, yes, I do. I think that, 15 men every year are worth more or twice as many. The next slide, just content warning, doesn't include more violent statistics. Oh, I'm sorry. Nope, not yet. That's the next one. I want to include this first. This is about the She session and just putting it in visuals. And I'm going to make this all available. It's being recorded, so you can look it over in more detail if you like. But the McKinsey & Company out of the States has been tracking gender equity in the corporate world for at least a decade. I want to say longer at this point. And the numbers during the pandemic have just been like just falling off the cliff of women. And they're primarily looking at white collar women, but not only, and looking at in heterosexual dual career couples, why there is such a drastic fall off for women during the pandemic and for the men. And that's a whole other talk, which I gave to United Way last year. But the simple answer is that if you're in a hetero couple and suddenly you have to be home all day with the kids and they need supports, who knows the teachers and their names? Who's probably earning less? Who probably has a little bit more flex to their work schedule? So who's going to be the one that's home with the kids all day? Is it going to be the person who doesn't know the teacher's first name, or is it going to be the person that's been talking to the teachers all year? And so it's not that the pandemic caused this, it's that the pandemic just pulled the curtain back really sharply on these realities that were already existing for working hetero moms in particular. But also it is a factor of the industries that got really gutted tend to be female dominated ones. So why are there more female servers than there are male servers? All of that also warrants further investigation. Also, in 2020, the same organization tracked that the 6th year in a row, so not just pandemic stats, women and women of color in senior management roles compared to men. And then again, on the left is for white men and women, and on the right is for people of color. You can't just explain those numbers by women are making choices to leave the workforce once they have kids. Oh, their priorities are elsewhere. Oh, they don't want these jobs. Only men do. Somehow magically when men become fathers, they don't have feelings and don't want to be with their babies, but women must. It's a requirement. That's nonsense, of course. So this is the slide I was talking about with the more violent realities. You probably are familiar with these statistics. They're not a secret. They're well known. 1 in 3 women in Canada will experience sexual assault in her lifetime. And I say when I talk about this in public room settings, look around the room. Look how many people are here. Look around your brokerage. Look around. Do the math. This is not a removed issue that's just, something that's featured in the New York Times to somebody in Central Park. This is the lived reality of women, that women are scared to walk to their cars alone at night in a dark parking garage. There's a reason for that. Every 6 days in Canada, a woman is murdered by her intimate partner. We know this number has gone up during the pandemic. We don't know what the numbers are yet. They're not out yet. But this was before the pandemic. 80% of intimate partner homicides, the victims are women. And of course, we know that it's even worse for Indigenous women and that they are murdered at 6 times the rate in Canada of non-Indigenous women. This is a lived reality. This isn't something that hides behind in, quote, inner cities or, far northern reserves. This is the lived reality for women in Canada, and it hides. And in this setting that I'm speaking in today, I think it's particularly important because as a person who worked with at-risk families told me once, he said, all the problems you're seeing in the low-income neighborhoods exist in the highest income neighborhoods. They just have the money to hide it. And I think that's really insightful and important. And so when we look at our industry and we look around, and people, especially who are working, say, in the luxury clientele, it's not that there's less violence. It's not that there's less sexism. They just have the money to hide it. So, all right, we have problems. This is a given, you know, but what does this have to do with real estate? And I was asked this recently. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, so we have problems in society. All right, we're not at gender equity yet. But I mean, real estate doesn't really have anything to do with that, does it? It's just the buying and selling of property. Well, no, is the quick answer. It's like that TikTok, you know, the answer is very deep. The answer is very profound. The answer is no. At just an initial level, as I've been alluding to, it exists in your brokerages. It exists in our boards and organizations, from the extreme of the violence to the, what we call the microaggressions. I'm sure you've heard that term, you know, women being referred to as skirts. I heard that in my first month, you know, pretty faces versus experienced faces. I heard that in my first month too, and no one comments on it. No one thinks about it. It doesn't necessarily land that you just put at two, that you can't be both. You can't both have a pretty face and be really good at the real estate industry, that these have to be opposites or differences. Now, I have here on the screen something called the spectrum of harm. So this is an academic term for gender violence. And what it means is basically essentially exactly what it says. I have a friend who, he's a man, and he works with men to reduce gender-based violence against women. And part of his work is working to avoid recidivism, so reoffending. And he said to me once, in all these years, I've never worked with one offender who on a Friday night was getting ready to go to the club and thought to himself, I'm going to find a woman tonight and I'm going to rape her. Like, that's never happened. So how do you get there? How do you get to the point that you believe you have the right to attack and try and own a woman and her body? Well, it doesn't start there. It starts here. And that's why we call it the spectrum of harm. And so he works with boys groups and like the OHL and groups like that to understand how you throw like a girl is the beginning of the spectrum to devaluing women to the point of believing you have a right to them and their bodies. This exists in real estate, the microaggressions within the industry itself, in every factor. And really simply put, real estate is a part of society. It's not like there's some dome of silence, you know, protecting the real estate industry and our transactions or our organizations from the reality that we all come from, right? It's sort of analogous to, there's been a lot of discussion around race-based violence in the States in particular, but here too with policing. And something that has been tried to be articulated is that it's not the same to say that there's institutional racism. That's a different thing I'm not talking about right now. But that if you come into a space where you have authority, police officer, teacher, lawyer, judge, and you hold racist ideas, even if you don't identify them as racist ideas, that influences how you're going to treat the people in front of you. Same is true with sexism and any public space. It's not like we leave our sexisms at home and then we come in and suddenly magically we're all gender neutral and we're magically don't have any of these preconceptions and we magically just become these genderless, embodied, neutral, you know, creators of industry. No, you bring it in. You think there's still these stereotypes and ideas that women aren't as smart as men, that women aren't as powerful negotiators as men, that women aren't as good with money as men, that they're not as good with numbers as men. These are not a tiny minority of people who hold these ideas. And it comes through from the little kids in the classroom and the really subtle ways of like, oh, boys will be boys. And oh, look at, you know, they're being rambunctious and we comment on it. Oh, boys being boys. Girls are playing quietly in the corner. Oh, girls are being girls. And we don't comment on it because we're not tuned to see it when the boys are sitting quietly and playing and when the girls are playing rough and tumble. So there was a study done in 2015 by these three scholars, Pham, Turnbull, and Waller. Two of them are out of University of Florida and one's out of Virginia. And it's called Sex and Selling, Real Estate, Age and Gender, Bargaining, House Price, and Liquidity. And it's an academic study. It's an academic paper that I pulled these quote from, which looked at quantifiably are female agents treated differently than male agents over a decade of study in Virginia. So it is in the States, it is in Virginia, but they even make the point quite convincingly that what they did and what they were looking at can really be broadly extrapolated across North America. It wasn't like they were looking at really niche stuff. They were looking pretty broadly and at intersections that were not state specific. So I include here 3 quotes from the paper, and that the bargaining power of agents depends on, these are from their conclusions. The bargaining power of agents depends on their sex and that of the agent on the other side of the transaction. Also, female selling agents have stronger bargaining power when facing female listing agents than when facing male agents. And lastly, that the bargaining power of male selling agents is stronger when facing female listing agents. Now, they were only looking at data, like they were looking at numbers from transactions, and now the saying, numbers don't lie, but people do. It's how you interpret numbers. I always say that, but they weren't talking to people about how they felt about their experiences, which is valid for other reasons. They were just looking at the numeric value. They did other things too, but for these analyses, they were looking at the specific quantifiable, what are the results of these transactions? And it was one of the first studies like that that really sort of brought home there is a quantifiable economic outcome of whether the male listing agent knows that the buyer rep is female and vice versa. Now, we need to talk about how everyone's experience is not the same. That's a given. And it's not just split between men and women. It's not their 2 sides. First of all, men can be incredible allies. Some of my greatest mentors in both academia and real estate have been men. Some of the most understanding, supportive of realities of women in spaces have been men. Likewise, I hold a lot of privilege. I am a highly educated, white, English first, born in Canada woman. I carry a lot of privilege when I move through the space in Canada, despite and because of, in some cases, my gender and my sex. A recent study showed, that is from 2019, that white women see the pay gap between men and women, but they tend not to see it between themselves and women of color. Mm. They are aware of gender disparity. They're not aware of racial disparity. And it's actually, this is a study out of the States, and I don't have a nice graph for the one that we use out of Canada, but it's actually worse. Canadians are worse at seeing race than Americans are, which is a double-edged sword, but that white Canadians tend to believe race isn't a problem here, and that that's an American problem. And so they tend not to see the race-based microaggressions. They tend not to see that when a Black woman is experiencing the microaggressions in their workspace, well, is it because she's Black or is it because she's a woman? Yes. The answer is yes. It's both, and you can't just draw this firm line. So I'm a firm believer that women really need to support each other in the corporate and public space. That there's a lot of quantifiable evidence and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that women are worse at intentionally tearing each other down than men are in public spaces. Men do it, I'm oversimplifying, but again, there's studies behind me on this. Men tend to do it unconsciously. Women tend to do it consciously. That's the difference. And I really believe, because it's like, okay, my job's always to point out the problems. That's great, Laura, thanks. Let's all go have a miserable day. But so what do we do? How do we improve the situation for new female agents coming in? How do we improve the industry so that women in positions like yourselves don't have added challenges to what are already difficult jobs because you carry 2 X chromosomes? So I believe that step 1 is that empowered women empower women. I know it's cliche, but it is fundamentally true. And that when women are treating it like we have a very small piece of the pie and therefore I'm going to defend mine with a fork, you're not improving the situation. You're not expanding the pie. You're making it harder for women. And so sorry, I've got a barking dog downstairs. I really do believe that one of the first steps, I don't know which one comes first. They're basically paired. One is educating men to be allies, and the other, so that they start seeing it. Because often, even male allies, my husband is a a vocal feminist, he doesn't always see it. I have to point things out to him and say, that was a really sexist thing that just happened, and I'm really upset. And he's like, well, maybe he just meant, like, no, that's not what that was. So one step is helping men see it and using their privilege to name it and holding each other accountable to it. You know, hey, dude, that's not funny. And the other part is women having the internalized confidence and empowerment to not be threatened by other women in their space and to encourage other women in their space and say, you know what, let's be allies and not, well, if you're here, then my pie just got smaller, so I stab you with my fork. To talk about what I'm just about to lead into of this, I just want to do a very quick 101 history of Western feminism if you didn't take a women's studies course in university, because people usually, and this goes for people across genders, often don't know what we mean when we say feminism. I mean, some people still think it means man-hating, and I heard someone say recently that I think we should just get rid of the word feminism and it's just there's normal people and there's sexist people. Like, can we just, you know, but since we're not there yet, first wave feminism is the suffragettes, largely looking for women to have the right, and they also were active abolitionists. Second wave feminism is what most people think of when they think of feminists. That's our mothers and our grandmothers in the 60s, you know, leaving the house, the marches in the street, the women's lib movement. That's second wave feminism. Third wave feminism was a reclamation of the feminine. So second wave feminism tended to really adopt masculinity and try to reenact in the workplace. Like, we want to be in the workplace, but to be accepted, we have to act like men. Again, these are gender roles, social gender roles, nothing to do with how you're naturally, biologically orchestrated. In the third wave, women started saying, well, you know what, actually, it's a valid choice to choose to be home with your kids. It's a valid choice not to have children. It's a valid choice to have children. It's a valid choice to love quilting and cooking and all these traditionally feminine arts, and to devalue them is perpetuating sexism. It's not helping. Now we're in what we call fourth wave feminism, and basically that's bringing in a more queer and trans inclusive, it's very sex and body positive focused, and it's gone digital. It's the internet, it's Facebook, and it's also intersectionality was brought in third wave feminism. Now it's common. When I talk to my undergrads, most of them already know what intersectionality is. In 2000, I didn't when I went to university. So what is intersectionality and what does it look like? This goes back to what I was talking about, how white women tend not to see the other challenges of women of color and Black women. So intersectionality is understanding that white middle-class women don't claim the flag for all feminism, that it is one experience reflective of one, what we call social location, where you are, and that it's valid and important, but that, for example, when white women were seeking to go into the workforce in the 60s and 70s, Black women had never left the workforce because they'd had to work to support their families, often as nannies and housekeepers, and that was just sort of erased. It's recognizing that for some women, feminism is covering their entire bodies head to toe because they don't want to be judged for how they are seen. For other women, it's walking in a bikini. And the understanding that all of these experiences intersect, and that for women who do not embody certain gendered ideals, we'll call it, they encounter more challenges. So again, that reference to if a Black woman is experiencing microaggressions, is it because she's Black or is it because she's a woman? Yes. You add to that, she's a Black woman in a wheelchair. Is it because she deals with a disability? You know, yes. So you have all these layers, and these layers directly correlate to economics. So C-suite women, for example, are almost all white middle-class women. There are not a lot of queer Black women in wheelchairs in C-suite positions. I don't actually know any. I'm not saying there aren't any, I just don't know of any. It was definitely within the last 6 months when they released the current name of everybody who heads a Fortune 500 Fortune 500 company. There were more Michaels on the list than all women on the list combined. So it's understanding, why do these intersectionalities directly correlate to our numbers of representation and it's true for home ownership, it's true for brokers owners, it's true anytime you start adding, I'm gonna call it power, degree levels, position, holding a partnership in a firm, being the head of a hospital, all of these markers across industries, this is true. So what do we do? All right, Laura, tell us all these miserable things. My first spouse used to tell me that I studied depressing things, that was my job, to study depressing things. And there's truth in that, but I actually find great hope in all of it, because you can't fix problems if you don't identify the problems. If we all just pretend that real estate is this magically gender neutral space where everyone gets treated equally, whether you're a buyer, homeowner, broker, and none of that matters in here, then nothing will ever get better. So let's name it, and then let's work to improve the situation. And so I have a few suggestions. Yeah, Lisa.
I just want to add a point there. I think that is the biggest problem. Like, I have this discussion with Tanya all the time, and coming from the real estate sector on a broad spectrum, sure, I can understand that point, but coming from the real estate aspect on a board and association level, it's they don't get it. They don't understand it. I feel like I'm a talking time bomb that they don't want to hear. And literally every time I'm opening my mouth and sharing something with either Uria, Kriya, even Treb, I will tell you, I feel like I'm talking to the wall, because they just don't understand this aspect at all. So the awareness, even bringing awareness to them, they don't want it. That's the sad part.
No, I think that's totally true. And it's true in a lot of male-dominated spaces around this issue. I mean, there's other truths in other spaces for sure. And I'm not just trying to put that all on men only. But I do think that one of the first steps is that, because it's all a reflection of society and it takes time, like this is not something we change in a year, and it's not even something we change in a decade, but change can also come pretty rapidly. Like if you look at where we were, what conversations as a society we were having 10 years ago versus the ones we're having now as a society, they're very different. And it doesn't necessarily mean that opinions have changed. That's an important difference.
But there is a change. In the last 10 years, you've seen more people of color step up into exactly. roles. And whereas like 20 years ago, you can't say that. 100 years ago, you can't say that.
No, that's 100% true. It's 100% true. And what we find, so in history of human rights, one of the things that we can consistently see is that, let's take that block. Let's call it kind of the upper middle block of we'll talk about the boards right now, but like that sort of middle block. Sometimes it's school administration. We've seen a lot around school administration. It was also around like fair housing policies in the 50s. So that block is not going to move on its own. You might have one or two people in there. It's not going to move on its own. What moves it is the pressure this way. So sometimes it's federal legislation. These schools will be integrated. That's going to happen. And again, that doesn't mean overnight everything is suddenly magical. I mean, Ruby Bridges had rocks thrown at her. There's things take time to change, but it had to be imposed on them. There's also a reflection of this. So I'm not talking about any board in particular, but just let's take an imaginary board that is made up entirely of white men who are not allies, who do not consider gender equity to be important, relevant, and who are overtly sexist. Like, this is just my imaginary board. So there's 10 of them, and there's one woman on that board. Those men may never change their mind, but they're not going to be on that board forever. And if you're working with people here who understand from the gate, from kindergarten, from grade school, through high school, through university, through real estate training, through the climate in the brokerages where they work, that this language is not acceptable, this behavior is not acceptable, here is why. The things that are changing already in the grade school level are mind-boggling to me. The awareness that my kids have that was just not on the radar, even when I was in school, let alone when my parents were in school. Worst case scenario, those boards change. And in time, those people may never change their mind. You know, the people who enslaved people didn't tend to change their mind. But do their grandchildren think that that's correct? No, because it takes time to change opinions. And so at the worst case scenario, if you can't change people's minds themselves, their opinions become irrelevant over time. So that is one of the realities. And part of that is, what do we do on the day-to-day basis? You know, maybe that board space will never be a safe space. But one of the other things, I'm just throwing this out there, I'm not saying it would change for there, but I mentioned my friend who works with male groups. That's why he works with men's only spaces, because he finds they will listen to him in a way that they won't listen to women. And he says from the beginning, he's like, I'm not saying that's right. And I'm not saying that I'm saying anything new. It's just that as a white, straight, Northern Ontario hockey playing guy, and he's sitting in the OHL change room with these kids and they're asking him questions, or they're saying, yeah, but, when he says, okay, but have you thought about it this way? They go, oh. Whereas when he's seen women in those spaces say the exact same thing, they go, okay, thank you, have a nice day. And then nothing changes. So that's why male allyship is also important. Women would never have gotten the vote if men didn't vote for women to get the vote. You know, the enslaved peoples of North America would never have been emancipated if there weren't white people in power who made the decision. So allies are essential for change. You may not have any allies in a particular set group, but male allyship is growing rapidly and it's growing every day. And so we just have to like circle them with these waves that are coming in. Yeah, Asha.
It's interesting looking at all the stats and all that, but I think the issue, I think Lisa brought it up, we're still living at the board levels in the male-dominated boardrooms where they are not listening. Even when they know what they're doing is wrong, they are still doing it. Like they'll give you, pacify you by listening to you, but they are not listening. And I'm sorry to say that when you look at Korea, you look at Uriah, you look at Treb, you look at Mreb, you look at Barry, I don't know what Tanya's experience was, but it's terrible because we're just getting lip service. And once term gets finished and whatever, and then you put it behind you and you move on. But what change have we brought? Even when being in the position of power, we are not able to do it. And that is very disturbing because I love the stats that you brought, but we need to bring the change and it's not happening. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, it's pretty much in every boardroom. Like I'm somebody who's literally shoving my ideas down their throats because I've been around long enough and I don't really care. So I am not joking because I
love it
to them. Like I am not listening. If the guy is not listening, I will say, like, you're not paying attention to what I'm saying, and I'll stand up for it, but I'm doing it. But it's not happening everywhere. We're still, look at percentages, we are still having more men on the board level and we're electing them. We're putting them in those positions. So I think it's a very deeper issue that we need to really do, because Lisa was the president of Toronto Real Estate Board, one of the biggest organizations in the world, right? She got there also, men supported her. She had great people behind her and all of that stuff. But bottom line is, change isn't taking place. And that is what we have to handle. That maybe one of the things should be mandatory. Every director who gets a position or runs for a position has to go through this training to know how you have to empower women at the board level. Maybe they need to be smacked on the head to saying, pay attention. Like when you're in a boardroom, this is how it's going to go down. But at this moment, I don't see it, because I don't see a whole lot of change that's taken place. Just because we elect a few women in the position of power is not good enough. It really is not.
So two things. I want to back onto Asha's point too. And I will say this, like even though my presidency has ended, and Tanya knows this, that I'm still fighting for women, for people of color. I'm fighting for generations right now, and it's a lonely battle. And there's many moments of why am I doing this if nobody else is speaking up on this? And but the other part of it, it's so close to my heart. But to Asha's point, in my term of presidency, I had my past president who was, the typical, middle-aged Caucasian male who had challenges letting go of his own power. So he kept, even though I wouldn't give him the floor, he would go ahead and speak and think that it was okay. And turn around and just speak and think that it was okay. And instead I'd get a text message from another female on my board saying, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking, right? Like it was just, and even though the awareness is out there, and yes, we're saying we're getting better as a society, we're really not, because there's a certain degree of population that just don't want to change no matter what. And even, and to Ash's point, even on the CEO level, if you don't have a really good CEO that understands these things, nothing is going to get done. And it's a lost battle too. And I'm even speaking on RIA and CREA's associations.
So I have three thoughts on that. One is, because I'm a historian, I always look at things over the arc. And if you think back to the slide history of feminist movements, first wave feminism, the Western iteration of this, began in 1840. Women started advocating for the vote in, actually sooner than that, but the organized institution was 1840. Women didn't get the vote until 1918. Some of those women weren't alive to see women get the vote. And every human rights movement, but I'm going to talk about the women's rights movements first, have felt exactly what you're saying. You are not alone, and it is not unique, and it's not unique to this industry. Women have been slamming their faces against brick walls, getting arrested, getting force-fed for decades to get things moved. And the women, I mean, Nellie McClung, one of those Canada history movements, it's true that the premier of Manitoba wouldn't even speak to her when she was just an agitator. And then once women got the vote, he wanted a picture with her in public. And she said, but Mr. Premier, I thought nice women didn't want the vote. Surely you wouldn't want a photo with a woman who was not a nice woman. Like, these are women, and this is not unique to the suffrage movement. I use it because it's one that we all take for granted right now, that these women not only had doors slammed in their faces, no one would talk to them, literally no one was listening. They were arrested and put in insane asylums, as they were called then, because no smart, reasonable woman would want to vote. And so this is not new, this is not unique, and you women who are taking on these fights you're standing on the shoulders of incredible giants, and there'll be many who come after you who feel exactly like you do. It is isolating. It is exhausting. It is frustrating. And I can't remember if I told you this, Lisa, when we were talking before, but I was having a day during my PhD studies, and I was talking to my supervisor, and I was really frustrated. I said, it has been 100 years since women got the vote, and we're still having these debates. And he looks at me and goes, still? Laura, you're a historian. 7,000 years of human history, 100 years of the vote. He's like, it's only been 100 years. Not that it's already been 100 years. It's only been 100 years. It takes people longer to change than that. It takes generations. And like that indigenous saying, the Haudenosaunee, the changes we make today aren't for us. It's for the 7 generations in front of us. So when you say it's not changing, I would say, I agree. I believe you. But does that mean it will never change? Because what you're doing is, even when you feel like you're making no progress, you are planting seeds. And what I find often when I'm engaging with people, because you're right, there are people who will never change their mind. There are still people who think that women should belong to men. Like that, yes, there are always people, but the vast majority of society shifts as trends shift. And you don't know who's listening. That's something I've found again and again in activism. This person I'm talking to that's making me like lose my mind of frustration, and it's not going in and nothing is changing. And then someone a year later will come by and say, I heard that conversation and I've been thinking about it ever since. And I think I need to change this, or I need to, and then that person finds themselves in a position of power.
I agree with that, but I also have hope for like Ash's grandchildren.
Yeah.
Era. I have hope for those children. But between now and then, if we don't pick up the slack, it's not going to get there.
And see, in the institutional level, you all are more familiar with that than I am, that how do you make that? Because what I think of when you're talking is women in politics, which was my area before. I thought I was going to end up in politics, but I spent a lot of time in political spaces. And as I'm sure you all know, I mean, Kamala Harris, when you're talking about being spoken over, that's why every friggin' woman across North America, regardless of politics, stood up and cheered when she said to Mike Pence, I'm still talking. I'm not done. Shut up. And every woman in professional space has experienced that. And most men, I was trying to explain this to 2 men in my family who I love dearly. They were not believing me. They're like, no, her politics, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, you're missing the point. But other people saw that and other people heard that. And so my question back would be, at an institutional level, how can you make change? I know how it works in academia. I know how it works in politics. Think consequences, changes of boards, et cetera, et cetera. I know that it will change in time with real estate. I know it will change with these conversations and people going in their spaces. And sometimes in activism in general, like human rights change, it has to be multifaceted. There's the big stuff. There's the, like Asha saying, like, let's have training. Let's have people have to have these conversations. I think that's really important. It's also the really subtle things. And often it's humor. When I'm sitting, so far, my approach in real estate has been, I'm sitting in these meetings and someone's saying something and I'm a newbie. So I'll just ask a question. I'm sorry, can you explain why that's like that in this way? And just go ahead, explain your sexism in public, justify it, but in a completely neutral way. That's obviously not the position that you're in, Lisa, but I mean, my point is that there's multiple strings that have to be pulled simultaneously to make change.
Sorry, I'm going to have to leave the meeting at 12. So I think this is a much longer conversation that we need to do.
Decades.
Doing it, but as I said, I am very frustrated because we're not making headway. And I don't want it to be that it's going to take us another 100 years where we can have that. I think we are the women in position of power. We kind of have to take the torch and say, you know what? Maybe training is needed for anybody who's going to be at the board level. Maybe CEOs need to go and get trained again about how to deal with women. How do they approach them? And same thing is, Laura, I don't want to use humor to pacify these men to ask a question. No, I should be able to ask a question as a woman. I shouldn't have to just say, oh, I just got to be nice and ask that question. Why? If there is
the why, I'm going to answer the why.
Why?
Because I totally affirm that. But because it's in that moment, and I'm not saying either is right or wrong, it's what's your goal. If my goal is to make a point, then I do it very directly. If my goal is to change their mind, then I do it in a way that I put them on the seat where they have to think through their actions. And so they're not in a defensive position. They have to justify to me why it's okay what they're doing. And I do it in a non-threatening way because then they go, this is my favorite sentence I hear. I never thought about it that way. If I go at them, which I do many times in many settings, but if my goal is in that moment, in that meeting, to get them to change how they're thinking, if I go at them, they're never going to change their opinion. That's justified and right in many settings. But if in that moment I want them to change their mind, then I need them to think. And if they're feeling defensive against me, then they're not thinking, they're going into fight mode. So that's my why in that. But I'm not saying you have to or you should. I'm saying it's a question of tactics of what you're achieving in a given moment, in a given setting. That's the only why. It's not to be nice and it's not to placate.
I apologize. I think I am at a point where I am not willing to bend down and just say, yes, whatever they agreed with and how they can I get them to go my way. If I have a right opinion, it's going to be heard. And I think we women have so much power. We need to really bring about a change. And as I said, like what the slides you provided today is they're fantastic. And you know, Virginia, Lisa, you know that Virginia's put together that CWC group, the Canadian Women's Council of Professional Real Estate Women. So this is the first of its kind. And I think those could be the platform where you bring a lot of women together, but you bring men to listen to these ones too. And these powerful men, those who are not listening.
Oh, absolutely.
Going into, Laura, I mean, who is the CEO of that? Who is the president of that? Who is that? They pretty much, most of them are white middle-aged men.
Oh, absolutely.
Not even middle-aged, maybe even over that. Yeah. So I think that we need to have a lot more conversation. Maybe we have to start getting some tools together that we can work with to bring some change about. But I love all the information you have. But I've been in real estate for over 30 odd years. And I tell you, I've seen where the managers took the secretaries out all the time and that's just what it was. And if I could write a book about all the scandals out of real estate, it would be a bestseller because that many skeletons are out there that I know of. So
I'd read it, Asha. I'd read it.
I'd say you should. And the other thing about, you're saying women empowerment, before you go, one thing that I think is really important and why we need allies is because there's like we were talking about already, women are not necessarily women's best defenders. And there's also something that's called moral licensing that a psychologist coined, which is when sexist organizations, racist organizations do one thing that proves that they're not sexist or proves they're not racist, then they have moral licensing to dig way back. So women, the first woman who was admitted to this really important artist league, they didn't allow another woman in for 75 years, but they were clearly not sexist because she had been allowed in. There was a study that led to this moral licensing term, that white Americans who voted for Obama were more likely to make racist statements after having voted for him than they did before, because they've proven they're not racist because they voted for a black man for president. So we have all these, like, this is a psychological social reality that as soon as we allow a woman on a board, it's an equal space. There's a woman on a board, regardless of whether she's actually an ally or not. There's a woman on the board, and there never needs to be again for 50 years because we've proven that we're not.
Before Asha goes, I do want to bring up a point though, Laura. Just before Asha brought up her discussion, I just want to say that the challenge that we have though is we are fortunate in one aspect that, you know, the pandemic happened, that it brought out these issues on a bigger scale. They were already there. They weren't being talked about. Now they brought out even bigger. But the biggest problem that we've had is history repeats itself. So the pendulum has swung this way. Wonderful. And we're talking about these issues. It's the minute that we stop talking about these issues, that it's the minute it's that minute that all of this work just goes away. And the biggest challenge when it comes to boards and associations is that's exactly what they want to happen, because it's a constant changeover, right? You've got roles constantly changing. You've got people constantly changing. And the people that don't support things like this don't continue the process, unfortunately.
Well, and that's why you need to have it a broader base, that it's like my undergrads, the things that they fundamentally believe is a given is so different than what undergrads as of 30 years ago fundamentally believe. There are social shifts that as people, but we have to make sure they're the ones. So that's why people in positions of power, whether it's just a broker, I don't mean just, but I mean like not involved at a more institutional level, all the way through, can mentor people and say, you know what, you'd be great in this role, we should have you there. And it's why the other thing that I hear, and I don't mean this in any way negative, is burnout and exhaustion. Mm-hmm. And last February, after being an activist my entire adult life, I was burned out and I was done. I say, you know what, I'm uninterested in your excuses for sexism. I'm uninterested in your excuses for racism. I don't want to hear it anymore. It's 2021. Get with the program, grow up, or leave the party. I'm done. And so I need to take a few months off. And now I'm recharged and I'm ready to go back in, because what I'm interested in at the end of the day is change. And so what I'm interested in is what brings about change. But I just say that to say, this is why we need allies. This is why we need support of women's groups, and make sure you're taking care of yourself, because it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, and it will, I don't have to tell anybody here, it breaks you down. It exhausts you. It demoralizes you.
I can totally relate. I ran in politics twice.
Yeah.
And
so nice to meet you,
bye,
Asha.
Sorry, guys.
Thank you for coming.
You.
Oh, till the next time, Laura.
Yeah, till next time. Nice to meet you.
Bye-bye.
But I ran in politics twice. I was heavily involved in 20 different organizations, supporting them as well. And I will tell you, once you've given and given and given your entire soul in every aspect, you're done. And you know that it's not getting anywhere, but you feel like you put seeds down. And you're right, it's total burnout. I remember taking a couple of years out saying, you know what, I just want to enjoy life and have fun again, whatever that feels like. And then you miss it, and then you go back into it. And then you're still, and the worst part about it is I feel like all we're doing is I don't know, I can't speak for anybody else, but I feel like I'm just like you, where all I've done is advocate my whole life for people and for things and for society and for change.
No, exactly. And it's also, I mean, there are spaces I've just chosen to leave. Like after a while, like for my own mental health, it's like, this is going to have to be somebody else's battle. I'm not here for you. I can't do this anymore, and nothing's going to change here in my lifetime. And that's okay to say too. Like they can say, women are leaving multiple spaces a lot of time, which is a real problem, because at a macro level, it's exacerbating the problem. But at a micro level, you are a human being who needs to be okay first before all those other things. And I mean, I say it straight up, as a mom, I look at the images of Ruby Bridges going to school. I don't know if I could have sent my child through that at 6 years old. And the fact that someone was able to and did is why we had so much change. But I don't know that I could have. And there are just spaces that I have left, that I've gone, I don't want to say that you as a human can't change. I don't want to say that you're a bad person, but I no longer can engage in this toxic environment because it's not moving. And for me, I need crumbs. If I can get, I never thought about it that way, then I might need a 6-month period before we have another conversation, but you know, and it's true with friends, right? It's the conversations we have with friends. It's the conversations we have with colleagues. And this is why I began this by saying real estate is just part of society. Mm-hmm. And there's some things that'll be worse or more toxic about it, just like in any industry. But we have to change society to change what's happening. And so I say, teach your daughters to self-advocate and teach your boys to be allies, so that each generation is moving it further down the path.
I always, what I find interesting, and you know, my friendship through Lisa has opened my eyes to all of this. Listen, I'm a white entrepreneur woman. I know what my advantages are. Okay. And was I I'm going to say ignorant. Was I ignorant? Right. You know, when you said, you know, Canadians don't think that they're racist, right? I was like, no, really. I was like,
no, it's fair.
That is honest to God. That's the honest truth, because I think I've been in those situations. I'm like, I'm not, I support women. And then in the back of my mind, I'll make a comment and I'm like, and then you said that, I'm like, I need to reevaluate, you know, because you don't know these things, right? You are brought up, you know, you just don't see these things. And then, you know, over the last 3 years, I built a friendship with Lisa. So now I'm like having these conversations because my bubble are of people quite like myself, right? Not a lot of diversity. I admit that. So when I have these conversations with Lisa and I look at her presidency, and I often say this to her, you made so many strides in your presidency, right? So you're leaving this ripple effect on your way out. But I've always said, and I believe in my heart, because as a president as well, I know the impact I had to make was on staff and my executive officer, because they are the constant. When we think of boards and associations, you don't think of executive officers and staff, because the face is the board of directors, but those things switch out every year. Every year they move along, they do what they got to do, and then off you go. And that's just the way organized real estate is. So, you know, I've often had conversations with Lisa where I'm like, well, you know, we need to go and impact our executive officers. We need to go and educate our executive officers so that they can educate the staff, so that when the new people come in who have aspirations, majority of them, some are there just for the title, and we know that as well, that they have, like Asha was saying, a training, a reference, something to go back to. But if we don't educate those constants in organized real estate, really, it starts with you and it'll end with you when you leave. Right.
And I just want to change that too, though. But staff are also changing. Like, I think about brokerages. How many brokerages experience a lot of like shift through this pandemic of losing people? And even I can say this in the nicest ways. Even Trev lost staff, and you know, had to replenish positions and so forth. So even educating like staff and EOs and all that other thing, I don't think that's enough, because at the same time, that transforms just as much as the board of directors does too.
It's like COVID measures. One won't do it, but you need multiple levels of, so it's like, no, the staff and admin on their own, not enough. The board on their own, not enough. But when you have, it's like the Swiss cheese analogy, you put multiple stacks of Swiss cheese on each other. And that's why I say, like, the people coming in. The other thing that I think you're pointing to, is it Tanya or Tanya?
Doesn't matter.
Okay, yeah, you answered either.
I've been called worse on a good day, so don't.
Do you have a preference though?
No, I don't.
Call you T.
That's it. I like it.
That I think you're pointing to also is office culture, and I don't mean that just specifically as like a brokerage office, but the climate is. It's true whether it's an academic department. It's true whether it's a public school. It's true whether it's a neighborhood. You foster a climate and an environment. Most people, and this sort of points to something Lisa was alluding to earlier, most people live here on the spectrum. There are people here who will never change their mind. No matter, they're going to go to their grave believing what they've believed since they were 15, whatever. And there are people here who are already, people on this call, you know, like women should be in positions of power. We need to be aware. Most people live in here and want to do better, or they don't care. They're neutral. They're somewhere in there. Where they shift depends on the climate that they're in. That's social psychology 101. You will embody, we can think that we carry this individuality into a space. It's nonsense. Social psychologists have proven this for years. You will embody the crowd that you're in. Mm-hmm. So if we make the crowd space one where sexism is not acceptable, one where we check our language and we're aware that, you know, hey, sweetheart, bring me a coffee is not acceptable. And here's why. And you know, if we make that the environment, then it doesn't matter so much as people come in and go out regardless, because they're joining the crowd, even if they hold a position of power. Because I mean, well, I was going to say, how many people do you know? I'm thinking the people on this call, you can hold the position of power and you can't move the cultural climate of the organization. Yeah. So you can definitely have toxic effects. You can have very positive effects. I'm not saying you do nothing. But there are plenty of people in positions of power who leave because they cannot move the dial, for good or for bad. Mm. So create that cultural climate that people come into and have that the default, so that anyone coming in is going, and most of it happens subconsciously, we are fish who don't know we're in water. So that they know that when they enter this water, oh, in this water, this is how we swim. Got it. Cool.
Yeah.
You know, we have a lot more to discuss, and I know that times is an issue. But Laura, I just want to say, like, even that we just touched the surface of this. But we definitely need more of these types of conversations with you, and with our even President's Network. I mean, I think that there's a mass amount of women in that group that have all kinds of opinions that may not feel, you know, in the past to share. And I think, you know, creating that space and opportunity in the future will open up those avenues, and including hopefully bring us a little closer together, because there has been some of what you spoke of earlier, which is, you know, we're not all connected. We're not all celebrating each other. And a lot of times, you know, you witness it just being as a front fold for the world versus the actuality.
And it's so, I'm so glad you said that, Lisa. And it is so important. I mean, Anne-Marie Slaughter is one of my like role models. She used to work for Hillary Clinton. She's the dean at, I want to say Yale. I'm not sure it's true anymore. And she said she brought in these really pro-gender equity policies in her department, and part of it was naming gendered things. I can't make that meeting. I need to have, my daughter has a doctor's office appointment. You know, like naming these realities instead of pretending we're these disembodied creatures that don't have lives outside of it. And it was the women in her department who gave her pushback. You're making it harder for us. You're making, you know, we fought this hard to get this far. Stop talking about your kids. Stop talking about this. And she's like, this is how we move the dial. So I love that you name that, because there has to be conversation. We have to name the realities we live in, or it can't change. You cannot change something by la la la.
It's so funny. It's so funny you say that, because we have so I'm a director at large with the Ontario Real Estate Association, and we have our in-person directors meeting, and literally it is 4 days long. And I'm thinking in my head, and ask Lisa, I was like stressed about it. I'm like, Lee, where am I going? I got 3 kids and a husband at home, and I have a business. I said, I cannot be away for 4 days. And I was stressing about it. And finally, I let it go. And I emailed who I had to email. I'm like, look, I'm not going to be there till Wednesday afternoon. I have a family and I have a business. There's just no way I can be away that long. But for 2 weeks, I was like, I can't say this. Like I'm making it look like I can't deal with my commitments, but that's not the case. It's how can you be, you know, away for 4 days from everything? It's just not possible. There's only so much of me to go around. I have to strategize and split my time, and then I can make it work. And I just put it out there in the world. I'm like, deal with it.
This is the reality. Well, and you know, to the final point, that loops right back to the cultural that we create, the cultural context that we create. Because, so using my own examples, academia, especially human rights departments, are viewing themselves as very equitable spaces. The reality is one thing, you know, but that's the stated, this is how we do. That's the statement. Just like Canada, we are a multicultural nation. That's the law. Whether we live up to it's a whole other conversation, but that's the law. Mm-hmm. When you set that as, this is who we are, this is what we do, even if it's just lip service, you have that as a tag to hold on to now. You can say, hey, in the interest of gender equity, I need to name that I was a single mom for a while. Like, as a single mom, I cannot make these evening meetings, If we really are going to be a gender equitable department, we need to do it at a time where single moms can attend, or single moms can't do these things, or pregnant students, or, you know, whatever. Same thing. Whereas when we don't talk about it, and we build that corporate culture of naming and shaming, or not naming, but shaming.
Yeah.
And that's why you also need to have the people with the power to do it. We need more men who are fathers saying, I'm sorry, I can't do that at 4:00. I have to pick my kids up from school, so that it's not all put on. Just like we don't need just BIPOC individuals speaking up on race, because that's putting all the emotional labor on people from those communities.
Yeah.
But you know but speaking of which, I know we have to end, but I just want to mention something though. When you brought up those stats, I had a hard time with them. And the reason being is, we are justifying society. We're saying, okay, well, Black women, Hispanic women, and then other race. And speaking from an other race, I feel like I'm left out of the spectrum. I feel like I'm not included in the spectrum when they justify it that way. And that's really hard to watch. And I don't think that other people would understand that, but it especially when you're saying, okay, white women, this, well, why do I fall into another race? Like just the other category, when, our population is a significant amount of people like me, and people coming into this country that are going to be like me. So why in academic studies, aren't we included in that population, included in those numbers of people that were also justified to slavery and everything else too?
I think that's a really important point. And it's one of the challenges I find switching between academic spaces and corporate or public facing spaces, because the academic studies do slice down. Like, we're talking queer identity, because there's so many intersecting aspects, we're talking economic, we're talking, like there's so many different aspects that integrate. And then when things are turned, when studies like those slides, I didn't create them, I just used them, are created to be public facing, the approach is to give a sampling and saying, like, okay, Indigenous women, Black women, I think it was Latino women in that one slide. And as a result, on the one hand, the justification that's used, and I'm not affirming it, is that it's pointing out trends that indicate there's a lot more to the story, because most people, and I'm not saying you, don't want to hear the full 20-page academic breakdown. It's like, if there's too many words, get to your point. What do you get? Especially in a corporate culture, it's like, you've got 30 seconds, elevator speech, go. But I think that you make an incredibly important point that, if you are a Latino woman who went to Harvard, third generation, XYZ, your experience is important and valid. And it is different than an Indigenous Two-Spirit woman from Northern Ontario who grew up on reserve and got a scholarship through hard work to go to Harvard, and to get lumped together in the same place in a study as women of color is completely missing the differences that those stories, which is why I think stories are so important, and conversation is so important. You can't just send a memo and say, here are the numbers, You have to talk about what are the stories and the why. As an academic, we always want to know why. And that's always my question, whether it's back to somebody or whether it's this. It's like, okay, this is the reality. There aren't enough women in C-suite positions, and most of them are white women. Can we ask why?
But I guess that goes back to, like, if we're trying to get to an inclusive society, well, marginalize me into, and I don't mean me directly, but I mean me as a person of one race, by marginalizing me into, one category, then how do we ever get to inclusive? Because I'm not even considered when it comes down to the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's about making an impactful impression off the get-go so that we gain the interest. Just, I've seen this and I'm interested. I want to know more. How are you going to tell me? Can you break down these stats for me? I have people in my office, like I said, I work like 65% women, all different generations. Okay, you sent me this slide. I would reach out to you and say, like, do you have a breakdown of it? Can I get more information? So we're trying to be impactful right off the bat, and then draw you in to be interested, to want.
But I don't think that's enough, especially when our society is multiracial. So ultimately, if we're going to get more people of interest, become interested in some of the things, then they're also going to look for people that they can identify to. And that is reality.
I agree. I do. This is not a but, this is an and. I often wonder in public facing conversations how to do that, because at what point do I draw a line as a scholar in the public presentation? Because if there's one trans, disabled, autistic person in a study, do I include that as a number or not? Because, I mean, it's not my study. I mean, like in the regurgitating of somebody's study, because that person's identity matters too. They also, or if there's 5 people, the number's the less important part, but it's like there's so, and again, I'm not saying this is a but, or I agree with you 100%, Lisa. A question that I have as I work through public presentations and conversations, especially because people tend to tune out very quickly, is who gets left out, if anybody, and at what point, because there's like, are we talking about age? Do we talk about economics and continue to slice? Because those things all affect too. And those also are, everyone's identity is valid. And I don't mean that in an all lives matter sense. I mean that in the, I don't think we should be gatekeeping. I agree with you. I don't think there should be like, here are the 3 important categories and everybody else in a subcategory. I think we need to name and identify people's lived realities. I don't know, as an academic talking to the public, where to draw the line of whose lived reality doesn't get included. Because there will always be more people say like, well, yeah, but you didn't include people, autistic women of color, or whatever. And
completely get it. Yeah,
that's not an argument with you. I agree with you totally %. I'm just saying my own thought process.
No, we totally, and Tanya and I both are sitting here saying, yeah, we understand what you mean too. But listen, we could probably speak about this all day long, and probably would enjoy speaking about this.
It'd be better than what I've got to go do.
But you know what, like I said, we'd love to have you back, and even continue some of these dialogues and conversations, and have a lot more people. And in fact, I'd even like to, if and we'll talk to the group about it, but even inviting some of our board women to this and open up the circle, because these are conversations that a lot of them will never understand, or maybe some do understand, and would like to take part in them. So if that's okay with you, and we can arrange a time to set that up sometime in between the fall or winter, and if the world is kind to us, maybe even in person, you never know. So fingers crossed on that one too, because I'm sure that we'd appreciate it more to see each other.
It would be lovely. And it is a privilege. I am so honored that you asked me. I think these conversations are so important, and I'm so just excited to talk to such a powerhouse group of women. And I think that you're absolutely right, because when I speak to women's groups, what I hope I can do is offer some frameworks for women, because they know their lived reality, but sometimes they don't have the stats or the number, to say, look, this is not just my opinion, and men is a different conversation. So I think that's so important and so exciting. And I'm so thrilled that this group has that in their vision.
Well, in our IQ, we're also going to have you for our Trans Women in Real Estate Task Force, since that is continuing in this in this era, and we'll be starting up in the fall, and we've got a really special presentation that we're going to be dedicating to women in October. But we hope to have you as one of our speakers and share in on some of the discussions there as well.
It would be a privilege. Thank you so much for your questions and conversation. It's been a real joy. And it's every day is another little step that we're all taking together in our going back and forth between frustration and murder and just, walking.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. me.
Thanks so much.